Hi.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, guys. Good morning, Beverly. Good morning, Lois. Good morning, Estelle. Good morning. Our
David is calling. Come.
okay. Hi, David. Our learning today should be in the merit of the speedy return of the hostages in good health, for the healing of those who are injured, for all those people who were injured, specifically Pinchas Aaron ben Chavaleah, Rabbi Becher's son, who was injured, but the reports are that there no nerve damage or any other lasting damage, and I think he's been released. He was supposed to be released from the hospital today. Hopefully he was. And the many other people who have been wounded, the comforting for those who are bereaved, and the continued protection of the Israeli soldiers, and for all the people in the region, and all of us. Okay. We've been talking about the calendar, the first mitzvah in the Torah to the entire Jewish people, which is, as the Rambam has made clear, is specifically a mitzvah to the Sanhedrin, to the highest court and legislative body in the land, to declare the new moon, to count the calendar, to beginning with the what is called the first month, which is the month of Nisan, and I was making the point yesterday and before that the fact that we continue to have one calendar that is recognized by all Jews, and that we all celebrate the holidays when we have a Seder, which is the most celebrated ceremony, ritual amongst the Jewish people. We're all having it on the same day. This is not something to take for granted. It's hugely important, and is the work of course I hit the wrong thing here. Has been the work of people for many hundreds of years to try to maintain that. There have been moments where others tried to where there were people who felt like the holiday should be at a different time, and they were raging controversies during the times, and Rav Sadia Gaon was involved in such a dispute. For some reason, it wants us to learn Minchas Chinuch. I don't know why. We keep on going back to that. My fingers keep on going back to that. There must be something very important in that work. We'll stop talking. No, now we want. Apparently, we're supposed to learn the Aruch HaShulchan. It's very sensitive. Just stop talking till I find it. So that mitzvah for the Sanhedrin is actually called L'Kadesh L'Chodesh, Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctification of the new moon. And again, the sort of maintenance of the calendar. Yesterday, we also talked about a rabbinic mitzvah that we have, which is called Kiddush Levana, which is not this. The mitzvah of Kiddush Levana is a rabbinic mitzvah, and it seems like from the many of the commentaries, we saw a kind of a review of it, that what we're doing is sort of we're prayerfully celebrating the moon and its role in our calendar lives, and it's either a blessing of praise to God about the moon, or it's possibly, according to some, it's a blessing that we say, also sort of prayerfully celebrating the moon. But we are not praying to the moon. We are not thinking of the moon in and of itself. We are directing our prayer to God and thanking Him for creating it, just like we have prayers and blessings that celebrate lots of God's creations. But it's directed towards God. And this is important, that it's always recognized that our prayers and blessings are meant to be directed towards God. They're not supposed to be directed towards other entities. This is something the Rambam says in his foundations of knowledge, or foundations of belief. That's very important, that we recognize that prayers and blessings are said to God. They are not said to angels. They're not said to planets. They're not said to the sun or the moon. That our prayers are always to God about His creations. The Rambam in his codes made the point that that as far as he's concerned, one of the great mistakes, the historical mistakes that man made, and it had devastating consequences, was to start to pray and worship other things, even if you thought that when you're praying and worshiping these other things, you recognize that in the big picture of things, the one God was the creator of them, but somehow fell into a notion that it serves God to serve these other entities, and that eventually this goes down a kind of slippery slope, and we forget the part that is the God contribution to the whole thing, and we start to worship and pray and bless these things for themselves, in and of themselves. And this is one of those things that even when you're studying mysticism, you have to remind yourself about this, that even when you're taking a deep dive into some aspect of creation, you are always doing it in the context that this is somehow a way to connect to God, and that these are only there by the grace of God, and that as a way of connecting to Him and serving Him, that ultimately it's all about God. And this is it's one of the dangers of Jewish mysticism, that you can fall into this pattern with the best of intentions, but you can fall into this pattern and start to see forces in creation. Just because you're studying them and focusing on them, you could start to see them as something in and of themselves. This would be the equivalent of maybe a biologist who is studying a human cell, or because you're focused on the cell, you start to see the cell as a kind of universe of its own and lose sight of the interconnectedness with the rest of the body and the larger person. In fact, doctors are often admonished for sort of seeing the disease or the whatever phenomena they're trying to treat in a human being. They start to lose sight of the person that's behind the whole thing because they are so focused on what's going wrong and trying to fix what's going wrong. They lose sight of the person as a whole, and it can have devastating consequences if you don't see the person as an integrated whole. So sort of like that.
Rabbi?
Yeah, right.
Sorry, I'm a little late. But as far as you talk about that, one of the most obvious things in medicine is when a person is talking to, let's say, a doctor group, and they say something like, the asthmatic in room 6, they don't call him by his name. They call him by his own, but they call him by the illness. And so that really takes away from what you were talking about there.
Right. By the way, it's something I've noticed about how we see the world, even when we're very well-meaning. Like, for instance, let's say you would ask somebody, what's your passion? What are you focused on? And they would say something like, I want to, they would use a word like tikkun olam. I want to fix the world. So let's say you have somebody and that's their motivation. They wanna fix the world. So they find something. Let's say it's drinking water. They want to make sure that there's safe drinking water in communities that don't have access to it. And so they're very focused on that, which is beautiful. But one of the problems that can arise when you're so focused on what's going wrong is that you start to see the world, you start to see what's wrong with the world. And you don't, again, this began as a well-meaning exercise, and nobody, it's admirable, but the world view that you can fall into, and it's a kind of hazard of again, a well-meaning process, is that somehow the world is just broken. There's all these different places that are broken. And so one of the kind of symbols of this issue is, let's say you have an artist who paints a painting, and so the painting is just white paint on canvas, and then and let's say it's a rather large canvas, and then he takes just a little bit of black paint and he paints a little dot in the middle of the canvas, and then you would ask people who've gotten a chance to view it, what they think they saw, and most people would say it's a dot. That our eyes are drawn to the dot, even though it's just a dot, a little dot in the middle of a large white painting. But that's where we tend to do it. And some people might say that this is a survival, something that benefits survival, to be able to find and prepare for something that's going wrong is very important for us to move forward. And it's very important, but it's just a hazard of this, that we tend to, if somebody would say to you, when you look out at the world, what do you see? And for many of us, we see what's wrong, and we come to the conclusion that the world's broken or that everything's wrong. And it's a kind of hazard of this, which is that we tend to lose sight of the interconnected whole, and we focus on what we think is wrong. So, okay. Now we are at Mitzvah 154, and this is the mitzvah to to rest on Shabbos. That's how he characterizes it. The actual even verb that he uses here is the verb related to Shabbos. Again, I don't know what he said in Arabic, but in Hebrew, the way they write it is he shitzivano shenishbot b'Shabbat, that we should Sabbath the Sabbath. We should Sabbath the Sabbath, which we translate as we should rest on the Sabbath. That this word is most often translated as rest. The Kotzker Rebbe, who was one of the sort of remarkable Hasidic Rebbes, I think he was in the early-ish 1800s. I think early-ish 1800s. He chose to translate this as return. That Shabbos is about return. There's also this word comes up in many places, especially in the prophets. Shuvu Elai, return to me. Even the word tshuva, which is often translated as repentance, is built out of this root and is understood as a kind of return. So it's like Shabbos represents some kind of center that we move from during the rest of the week. And then when Shabbos comes, we return to this central place. So Shabbos is not a place outside that we take refuge in necessarily, according to this understanding. It's not some island that you take refuge in after 6 days of hard work, but it's actually experienced as a kind of return to center. There are those, Rabbi Foreman amongst them, but there's others who suggest that you could characterize the 6 days of the week as doing and Shabbos as being. You're just being. We in Western culture very much live in a world of doing and don't have a great understanding of what a world without doing would look like. A world of just being. In other cultures, they're more comfortable with the notion of being and what it means to say that word. But that being itself is rich and full and doesn't require doing in order to be meaningful. So that's how the Kotzker understands it. But anyways, that word is most often translated as rest on Shabbat. And that is may he be blessed saying, God, may be blessed saying, but on the seventh day you shall rest. It's quoting from Exodus 23 here. The first time we hear about Shabbos even before the 10 statements. We first hear about it in the context, we hear about God resting on the seventh day, but then as a command to the Jewish people, we hear it's one of the commands that are actually given post-Exodus, but before the 10 commandments, and that in the context of the mun, the people are told that the mun is going to be available for gathering 6 days a week, but on Shabbos, it's not going to be available for gathering, and that they have to prepare. There's going to get a double portion, and they have to prepare for what they're going to need on the Shabbos before Shabbos starts. So Shabbos itself as a notion of rest is already presented to the people before the 10 commandments. And then in the 10 commandments itself, it's one of the commandments. If you count, I am the Lord your God as commandment number 1, not everybody does, but if you count that as commandment number 1, then commandment number 2 is about idolatry, saying not bowing to and not staying away from idolatry. then number 3 was not taking the Lord's name in vain, and number 4 would be Shabbos. We're supposed to remember it. We're supposed to sanctify it. And then 6 days we're gonna do our work, and on the 7th day we're gonna rest. So that's mentioned there. It's just sort of interesting that the source he quotes is later than that. On the 7th day you shall rest. And note that this commandment has been repeated several times, and he explained to us that rest from types of work is an obligation upon us, but not just upon us. It's also an obligation upon our animals and our slaves. We do not have slavery nowadays. We are not planning on going back to slavery, but they did have slaves at that time, and that's a subject that deserves its own discussion. But the obligation is not on our animals, of course. The animals don't have a private mitzvah, but it's we are meant to rest our animals. Animals, for the most part, were there to serve our working days, and the slaves were also meant to be a part of our work week. And so our entire household, not just us, but all those different tools and extensions of ourselves that are part of that work week are meant to be at rest. And behold, that the regulations of this commandment have been explained in Tractate Shabbos and Beitzah, and the Mishnah Torah, in his writings, they have it in parentheses. He eventually has a whole section just devoted to Shabbos. Rabbi Foreman points out that if you look back at the way Shabbos is presented in Genesis, in chapter 1 of Genesis, it's a little confusing. It says, at one point it makes it sound like right after the 6 days are over, God rested. But then right away after that, it says God rested on the 7th day. So when did he rest? Did he rest at the end of the 6th day, or did he rest on the 7th day? And if he rested on the 7th day, that means that there was at least a part at the very beginning of the 7th day that he wasn't completely at rest. So what does that, how do you reconcile this? So his path is to suggest that rest itself has 2 functions. Rest is what happens after you complete your creative work, but rest is also a part of your creative work. It's a creative decision that the decision to stop is also very much a part of your creative decision making. And you could say it's one of the most important features of creativity. The result of your work is going to be very much impacted by when you decided to stop. And that this is a problem that some creative people have, which is that they don't know when to stop. And by continuing, they are actually undoing the creativity from before. In sports, it's often people who don't know when to retire. And you'll hear some people say that it affects their legacy because there are maybe a couple of years when they shouldn't have been active anymore, that kind of sully their legacy. You could imagine a painter who's painting and he just should have stopped. He should, and he just kept on going, and at some point undoes the beauty and messes with the integrity of the creativity they had before. So he's suggesting that rest or stopping the creativity, it plays these 2 roles. It's actually way of characterizing what follows the creative activity, but it's also a part of the creative process, knowing when to stop. So that's why it slips into that language of he rested on the seventh day. That resting itself there is a carryover from the creativity, but the carryover isn't actual active creative, but rather the resting that is part of the creativity. And this is mostly in the discussion of this in the oral law, in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then in the commentaries, it becomes clear that this is not talking about absolute rest. This means rest from creative activity, and creative activity is often characterized as a kind of combination of the mental and the physical. That what makes human beings if you talk about work that really represents the unique human capabilities, you're talking about something that is a combination of both of those, the physical and the mental. So, for instance, Ansel Adams, the photographer who's famous for his photographs of the American West and Yosemite and certain national parks. There's a story about him that he had a showing of his photographs, and one of the people that was at the showing was himself a famous author, and he was standing with Ansel Adams in front of a photograph, and he asked Ansel Adams, he said, "This is very beautiful. What kind of camera did you use when you took this?" So a while later, this author came out with a new book, and Ansel Adams famously asked him, "What kind of typewriter did you use when you were writing that book?" And this was a kind of jab at the assumption that photography is ultimately about the mechanism, the mechanics. But really what sets beautiful photographs aside is not simply the mechanics, but also the vision of the photographer, that the photographer sees something that we don't see, and then he's able to share it with us. And this is true about artists in general, paintings and other things, that it's the vision that they're sharing that is what is so spectacular, not just the fact that he technically knows how to capture things in life, but rather that kind of vision. So that combination of the vision, or the mental and the physical, is what the Hebrew word usually that is said to specifically refer to this is the word melacha, and because there's several words for work, but whenever melacha comes up, Rabbi Shimshon Hirsch makes this point that that's what it's capturing. It's capturing this kind of special representative final product or process that is the combination of man's kind of creative intellect and the physical. So for the most part, that's what we're resting from. We're not resting in the sense that you're just lying down or sitting in a chair. In fact, there are things you could engage in on Shabbos that might be physically taxing. You could move your table around or move your couch around in the room. If you're inside your house, that might be physically taxing, and that's completely permitted. but then flipping on the light, which requires almost no effort in order to do it, that's considered a problem on Shabbos, a violation of Shabbos. So it's this sort of invites us to even be mindful of different types of creativity that we're involved in, specifically the creative work that we're expected to rest from was, and this is almost entirely from the oral law, you could see hints to it in the text, but it's fleshed out and elaborated on in the Talmud, and that is the work that was involved in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, or the work that was actually done in the everyday use of the tabernacle. There are two different ways of looking at it. So ultimately, the Talmud derives that there are 39 categories of this kind of creative work. This 39 categories has subcategories and all sorts of branches associated with. And somebody learning about how the Jews observe Shabbat, and especially what we're resting from, that's not something that's you just pick up with a few instructions. It's something that you really have to live in the culture of people that are doing it for a while in order to get the nuance of how to do it. And the resulting experience practiced by people that are being mindful of it, and it's not just mindful of what you can't do, but also mindful of what of the being aspect of it, of what we're supposed to be engaged in during that time. When you experience it in a kind of context, it's very powerful. And Shabbos remains one of those contexts of Jewish life that is still extremely powerful, and it's often an entry point for a lot of people that are looking for a more kind of spiritual connection to God. And others, Shabbos is still one of those really important entry points. Famously, the Jewish writer Achad Ha'am said, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. In other words, it's one of those contexts that is credited, at least according to him, but many believe he captured a truth when he said that the Sabbath, the Shabbos itself, has been one of the contexts that has maintained the kind of spiritual essence of the Jewish people to this day. So it's sort of interesting that we have the calendar, which, when you think about it, has been so important in maintaining the integrity of Jewish life and Jewish unity. And then after that, you have the Shabbos, which in its own way has allowed for a point of contact with God and the Jewish people, also in a way that maintains the integrity of the Jewish people going forward. I was once asked by a pastor, this had nothing to do with my pastor's trips, this was a connection I had I have a friend and student named Steve Salinger, who's a dentist, and he had a client who was a pastor, and this pastor had asked him if he could talk about Sabbath observance, because he was interested in bringing Sabbath observance to his community. I forgot, he might have been in West Riders Park or Evanston or somewhere near there where he already had contact with Jews, and the Sabbath was supposed to be part of a Christian lifestyle as he understood it, and he very much he wanted to bring some of what he saw in the Jewish Sabbath to his Christian community. So I got a chance to meet with him, and I happened to have just coincidentally, I happen to have a couple CDs that were produced by a minister who was trying to do the same thing. I just happened to have it. My cousin had come across this, and she shared it with me. So I lent those CDs to him so that he could, hear it from another pastor. When I met with him afterwards, he said it was beautiful, but he said he doesn't think, after all, that it's going to work with his community, because he felt that you had to really be committed to the details in order to get the result. That just doing Sabbath just the way you want to is not going to work for a community. Maybe an individual could have it, but not a community. That really, for the community to be able to do it, you have to be committed to the details, and he doesn't see any way to do that with his community. It is an issue, sharing a Sabbath observance with Gentiles. It's one of those mitzvahs that is supposed to be uniquely a Jewish mitzvah. It's one of the ways of specially identifying Jewish people or the Jewish nation, that we are Sabbath observants. It's called an ot hi le'olam. It is a sign between me and you for generations, God says. And because of that, we understand that you're not supposed to encourage Gentiles to keep the Sabbath. The general notion of having a day of rest as a pragmatic thing in people's lives, that is valuable to all human beings, and that, of course, you could share. But the actual Sabbath observance, the way we do it, was meant to be something uniquely practiced by the Jewish people, and meant to be something that actually is distinct, a distinct Jewish practice. It's a special sign of the Jewish people, and it would seem like that's there's something about our Sabbath observance that's meant to teach the rest of the world about God, but it's for some reason necessary that it's distinct and unique. So we're not encouraged to actually share it. That's why I wanted him to get it from those CDs, not necessarily from me, because those CDs were a pastor that was trying to do it, and that I felt was okay for him to learn from a pastor. But anyways, that's a little bit about Shabbos, and that is our next mitzvah is going to be to sanctify the Shabbos, which we talked a little bit about yesterday and the day before. To distinguish it, the Rambam distinguishes sanctifying the Shabbos from sanctifying the new moon, and we'll talk more about that on Monday. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to learn with you guys, and I look forward to doing it again on Monday.
Thank you.
Be well. Okay. Be well, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.